There was a time when I encouraged Melissa to read a book about being a stockbroker specialized in China. And the book was pretty much the autobiography of a man who had lived that life and who had become as highly accomplished as one can possibly be in that field. And you could say, if you find this book depressing, if you find this book boring, this is not the career path for you. Well, this book is incredibly depressing and incredibly boring. And if you're interested in being a creative writer of almost any kind in the year 2023 through to maybe 2033, it might be worthwhile for you to be bored and depressed by it. The expression on Melissa's face just there was priceless. You didn't think that was the direction this book review was going to take. It's a horrible book. It's a terrible book, but it might be just the book you need to read. And I can say sincerely, the effect that this book has had on me is, in a word, horrifying. Okay. What does it take to be a comedy writer? Whether you think of that as writing comedy to perform yourself as a stand-up comedian on stage, you're writing comedy and you're working with a troupe of people. So it's a group of people, a team, and you perform sketches, whether that's live on stage or to be recorded and put on YouTube. And as the world is changing, as broadcast media is dying, conventional cinema is dying, certainly making money out of recorded music and albums is dying. Platforms like YouTube are taking over. Okay. You want to be a creative writer in comedy of some kind. What qualities, what characteristics, what methods do you need? Now, if I were not discussing this book, I might say to you, you need to have a really profound understanding of human nature. You have tremendous diversity of life experience that you can draw on. You have to have real insight into social contradictions, both contradictions that are up on the surface of society, for example, problems that are in the news and in the newspapers, and also contradictions that are everywhere concealed and that people deny the significance of. I think you really have to be a kind of dissident in your own society, or dissident in the society you're writing comedy for, writing comedy about. You have to kind of be profoundly unhappy with that society and wanting to challenge its assumptions, wanting to shake people in the audience out of their complacency, wanting to stir up and inspire some kind of. I could list off for you reasonably profound elements of what would make someone well suited to be a kind of. And then you read this book, and instead the guidance you get is write out the name Michael Jackson, and then write out all of the pop culture references that the audience will get before they sit down in their seats. Write out a set of the most common associations with the name Michael Jackson and how to put together the lowest order of hack comedy for broadcast television. The advice given in this book, it's not that it's good or bad, it's that it is chilling. He says at one point that you can't tell the audience anything they don't already know. He describes sitting and reading news articles and then working within the limits of the lowest common denominator of pop culture references people are going to get. And most of the value of the book is in the examples he presents you with, which again, for me, are horrifying. And you get to ask yourself, is this what you want to do with the rest of your life? Is this what you want to do with just 6 months of the rest of your life? Now, my experience in comedy, a part of it was back when I was 16 years old. I mean, I could figure this out, 16, 17, 18, something like that in those years. And there was a huge part of my life that wasn't about writing comedy at all. And during those years, I gained some, reasonably profound acquaintance with human nature and politics and history, and studied a number of languages and lived in different continents and cultures all over. So I gained some of the ballast in the tank that can help you be a writer of any kind later in life. Then I returned to comedy. And, you know, I think I'm making comedy videos where the punchline and the point is so obvious that nobody could possibly miss it. And what I see again and again and again is that when I'm dumbing down my act to what I imagine to be the lowest common denominator, it's not remotely low enough. And a very large percentage of people in the audience don't get it. And people write into me, on the one hand, not even seeing that it's comedy, not getting that it's a joke. This includes comedy acts where I'm holding up a teddy bear and speaking with a funny voice, like I'm putting on a ridiculous voice and using a teddy bear as a puppet. This includes comedy videos in which I am wearing a costume and putting on a funny voice, and viewers are interpreting this as deadpan serious, like as if this is a news report. And they're also interpreting this as if my thesis is 180 degrees opposite of what it is. And then beyond that, this is most striking when it's people who know me, who are writing me. In some cases, people who know me for many years. You know, people who do recognize that it is a joke, they do recognize that it's comedy, but they still manage to misinterpret the point and the punchline 180 degrees. So recently, someone I know who has a PhD and is a career university professor was consistently failing to apprehend the point of what are blatantly obvious comedy videos. So these were quite recent comedy videos I did where there's a song, there's like it rhymes, it's set to music. And there's not a lot of ambiguity as to what the point of the video is. And you realize, wow, okay, this is someone with a PhD, this is a university professor, and they can't follow this punchline. They can't get this. Now, look, with all of these same comedy videos I'm talking about, the number of people who do get the joke outnumbers the people who don't. But remember, I'm working within the self-selected audience of people who've been watching my YouTube channel for like 5 years. So like, it's a very unusual, like my regular returning viewers are very unusual people. And then, you know, you look at these other people, like in some cases, people who stumbled on my channel for the first time, and what a large percentage of them don't get it. So, you know, I think I'm already making content that's very easy to understand, very lucid, very direct, and frankly dumbed down for my audience. When I do comedy, it seems to me that there isn't any lower I can go. And what this book is about is precisely how much lower you can go and how much lower you are expected to go if you want to have a career as a comedy writer. Now, look, my definition of comedy may be more narrow than yours. A man climbing to the top of a tower and holding a watermelon that is full of explosives, and then throwing the watermelon off the tower and watching it explode into flame. To me, that's not comedy. And to me, that is the kind of joke or type of stunt that I would associate with a teenager uploading a video clip to World Star Hip Hop, you know, a website that used to be very famous in the past. Obviously, some people will do things like that here on YouTube, unless YouTube has now banned it, you know. But I get it. The audience laughs when you're talking about late night shows, Tonight Show with David Letterman, the Jay Leno show, so on and so forth. Everyone shows up to have a good time. Everyone there is already a fan of the particular style of the host. People show up and they're good-natured, sober or drunk. You know, people line up around the block and they're so happy to be there. And I can totally visualize how, you know, seeing the host of this show drop a watermelon onto the sidewalk and the watermelon explodes. Everyone's willing to laugh. But there is a sense in which I'd like to say to you, that is not a joke. And even that is not comedy. And the type of humor this is training you to write, it's interesting. I think I could say this is the year 2023. I'm recording this in. It's really sort of like TikTok humor before TikTok. To even call them one-liner jokes is a bit misleading because it's sort of like one word jokes at the end of a very brief setup. So I'll give you an example. This is straight out of the book. And again, the main positive value of the book is that it gives you these examples. I really don't care about how poorly written the rest of the book is. The quality of writing is poor through the whole book. Interesting. For a guy whose career is as a writer, it is a poorly written book. But the main value for you is just going through these examples and then sitting and reflecting on what it means to you as a writer and what you want to do with the rest of your life. A report came in the news this week that 2 police officers in Detroit have been caught as being part of a theft and burglary ring. Local citizens were shocked to learn that there's anything in Detroit worth stealing. Melissa laughed. Melissa's from Detroit. Again, understand that the audience is there to have a good time. They're a fan of David Letterman or Jay Leno or Conan O'Brien. This guy wrote for many, many different late night shows. He has a huge amount of, he is truly an expert in this field. Okay, so just give you one more example where, like, this is, to me, this is barely comedy. This is barely humor at all. So I believe it's Jay Leno has a can of canned meat, and the label says that it is boiled pork in water. And then he said, oh, but if you check the fine print in the back, that's not what I said. Oh, look here. And the camera zooms in. Actually contains boiled water with pork. Like, a lot of the humor is kind of half a sentence stating the obvious, restating the obvious, these very kind of simple contrasts. Now it gets worse. There's at least one chapter dealing with stunts. There's several chapters dealing with these film pieces that happen outside of the studio. It gets worse. This kind of very low level wordplay. Sorry, again, I could read out a whole bunch of examples here. All right, think about Moliere. All right, I mean, we could use Shakespeare or use some other icon. Like, at what point as a culture did we forget that comedy is supposed to have a point? Like, it's supposed to be driving towards something. But we can go back to the ancient Greeks, the extant ancient Greek comedians. There are only a few extant ancient Roman comedians, but there too, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Apuleius, the work that's now known in English as The Golden Ass. This is comedy that really has a point. It's not a one word quip at the end of relating a news item to you. Now, okay, I've said this several times. Those of you who are personal friends of mine may have heard me say this. What's happening right now on TikTok, sort of the 5-second joke, you can never concatenate those together. You can never combine together a whole series of little TikTok moments and make them into a full-length film. And you as a creative artist, you as a writer, you as a performer, you will never develop the skills you need to make a full-length film by getting really good at these sort of little 5-second clips. Think about writing a comedy novel. And the comedy novel is now an abandoned art form because there's no money in publishing novels anymore. Like, your ability to make money as a writer. This is the other thing. This is not addressed at all by this book, but the world has really changed. There was a time when you could make a living with a pen. There was a time when you could make a living with a typewriter, and it's over now. If you start with this very short format, honing your ability to write these very brief quips, another example that he discusses at great length and depth, and that he was very much a part of developing as an art form, the top 10 list. So 10 kind of irreverent statements about one topic in a top 10 list. So these very, very short comedic statements. All right, you can't really build your way up from that to long format. Think about writing a novel that has a story arc. It has a plot. It may have multiple intersecting plots. It has character development. It has motivation. It has tension. And it has comedy. And we're talking about a funny novel, a comedy novel. If you can write a novel like that, then you can make a film adaptation out of it. In terms of the number of words spoken in, say, a 1 hour and 30-minute film, I don't know if they make films that short anymore. Movies getting longer, 1 hour and 5-minute film, whatever it is. If you make a film, just the amount of dialogue will be far, far less than is contained in even a short novel. So that's already an act of kind of compression. Okay, but you can take a novel and adapt it into a full-length film. You could take the funniest moments out of that film and make them into short YouTube videos or short TikTok videos. You can take the long format thing and chop it up. Now, it's true, by the way, and many people would say this. Many people will say, oh, well, the movie is funny, but the novel is even funnier. And then there's another step to that. So, oh, yeah, you've seen that little clip on YouTube or that clip on TikTok, but you don't realize how much funnier it is in the context of the film or in the context of the novel. And again, that's because in that long format, you have a sense of who this character is. You have a sense of their motivations. You have a sense of the tension. You also just have a sense of things like what they're good at, what they're competent at, what they're incompetent at, their strengths and weaknesses. There are a lot of things that in that comedic moment, the audience's understanding of the character and the scenario and the stakes, as we say in theater, there's a lot there that won't be there in the clip. But nevertheless, the clip may be funny, So, I mean, this kind of short clip. So again, this guy, I'm sure when he wrote the book, didn't think of it this way. He didn't think he was writing with TikTok. But you know what? A man dropping a watermelon off the top of a tower, that's really like a TikTok clip. I mean, that's really the level it's at. Any of these kind of, one-line jokes, these short steps, which, by the way, that's the definition of a monologue here. The monologue has no thesis. It has no direction. It has no organization. It's just a series of these very short quips. And I want to reiterate this. These are short quips that are totally limited to addressing the shallowest and most easily recognizable elements of pop culture, things that the audience already comes in knowing and understanding. So this, yeah, you might think I'm only comparing this to Moliere. I mean, Moliere is considered a great master of comedy in the history of the Western world. Okay, let's say you want to make a parody of James Bond. That's been done again and again. One of the most famous examples is a TV show that was called Get Smart. So you want to make a parody about espionage. Now, whether that starts as a novel or a full-length film, in setting up the jokes, you may actually have to explain a lot of things to the audience that they don't know before they sit down. Like there's a way in which the audience has to learn, hey, this is how espionage works. This is how international politics works. This is how these negotiations work. This is why this spy is in this situation. And, here's how things are supposed to go. And now here's how hilariously it all goes wrong for this reason. But actually, my point is, even in an art form as lowly as the kind of parody spy movie, when you think about it, there's a lot of political content there. And there's actually a great deal of telling the audience, explaining to the audience things they don't already know. As opposed to having a team of writers sit down, leaf through the newspaper that day. And he describes himself sitting and looking through specific news listings on the internet. And his method is, with a pen and paper, write out pop culture associations with particular words, and then kind of come up with this shtick. Okay. So Melissa, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, you can. For me, when I was traveling through Detroit, Ottawa, Toronto, New York, we spent a lot of time going to comedy clubs in New York, and then Seattle. Saw a terrible stand-up comedy. We did this kind of coast-to-coast comedy tour. I was sitting there saying again and again, how is it possible that the quality of material these comedians present is so bad, it's so awful, and yet they cling to it and perform the same jokes again and again for weeks, for months, for years, for decades. Thanks to the magic of YouTube, there were several comedians where we looked them up on YouTube before we saw them in person. And the YouTube videos from more than 10 years ago, and we saw them in person, and they are performing exactly the same jokes verbatim more than 10 years later, So yes, people are claiming that. And I thought of late night television. I thought, look at Jay Leno, look at David Letterman, look at Conan O'Brien. And these guys are coming up with new material 5 nights a week. And the material is relevant to politics, and it's relevant to the audience. I mean, a large percentage of what's in the news. It may be relevant to, you can imagine, police misconduct, government corruption scandals, whatever happens to be popping in the news. They come up with new material night after night after night. And I would say those shows, you're talking about minimum 40 minutes of new material per night. How exactly you measure it may vary a little bit from show to show. So you have a team of writers. And I really thought, why don't more of these stand-up comedians or even the venues, why don't they look at what, late night television is doing right? Now, in a different sense, I could see you could look at what Saturday Night Live is doing right. Get together a team of talented comedians and a team of talented writers and start doing live comedy that really means something to the audience, in this way. So again, now, I know Moliere is a big name, but a lot of the jokes in Moliere are very silly. Same with Shakespeare. I'm sorry. These have a hallowed place in our culture, but it's, there's no such thing as high art and there's no such thing as low art. There's just art. There's no such thing as high comedy or low comedy. There's really just comedy. And whoa, that's really true. The ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans have dick jokes and they have anal sex jokes. They have a lot of gay sex jokes. In case you think something's from ancient Greece or ancient Rome, and therefore it doesn't stoop to these levels. Nope, they stoop all the way. So I decided to buy this book, and by my standards, it's a very expensive book. At a time when I was really despairing at the creative bankruptcy and self-indulgence and fatuousness and pointlessness of what was going on in stand-up comedy. And a lot of people today get involved with stand-up comedy and they think of it as a kind of therapy. They think, this is my chance to get on stage and talk about my childhood. Okay, Jay Leno doesn't do that. David Letterman's late night television doesn't do that. So again, from my perspective, this is a kind of interesting challenge to the currently prevalent assumptions. We went to all these stand-up comedy clubs, as it turned out, coast to coast. And we didn't go to New York to Seattle were the final 2 stops. And it's like, have we heard one joke about politics? Has there been one joke that even mentioned Donald Trump? Has there been one joke that mentioned Joe Biden? There might have been one, but incredibly few. And those the few I can remember were of incredibly poor quality, by the way, in terms of political humor. And there was incredibly little humor that just even setting aside politics, there was incredibly little humor that was about something that happened this week or this month or this year. So again, for me, I'm reaching out to this book because I'm thinking, okay, this is a model of what it means to write, what it means to write comedy, what it means to be a creative artist, in this. And, look, YouTube and all the other platforms that will compete with YouTube on the internet in the future, YouTube doesn't make it easier to have an audience, right? But it does make it easier for you to archive and immortalize your work and to feel like your work isn't just disappearing. I certainly can understand that if you didn't have YouTube, you spend a lot of time and effort writing material, whether it's stand-up comedy or sketch comedy, some other live performance, and you feel like, oh, I only used that joke for 1 month and now it's gone forever. Well, using the cell phone in your pocket, you can record your set and you can immortalize it on YouTube. So I do, even if nobody watches it or only your friends and family watch it, or you yourself later go back to watch it. I do think that's significant where you feel this is not a waste of time. But I do think all of us, we need to challenge ourselves and we need to challenge our audience by really coming up with new material all the time. So again, this is part of my reason for reaching out this book. Yes, I would.
Yeah, I would say so. One other thing. Okay. One other thing that is different about these late night talk show hosts and what we saw at stand-up comedy shows is the nature of the performer to the audience and the audience to the performer. The late night talk show hosts don't abuse their audience.
Yes.
And the audience doesn't abuse the late night talk show host. whereas, that's very common in stand-up comedy, and a lot of disparaging comments to both sides. And you've talked about on your own channel, your relationship with the audience, so to speak, and that back and forth. And but what I saw, so I have some experience with that, being both in the audience from your YouTube channel and being a performer on your YouTube channel, so to speak. But at least appearing on your YouTube channel.
Recurring character on the show.
And comparing that to just how blatantly they were, and how quickly they were going to just fuck you, to the audience directly.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example of that. So this both illustrates what Melissa's saying, and comes back to what I was saying earlier when I'm saying, look, my definition of comedy may be narrow, but a lot of this stuff, it's not comedy to me. It's not even a joke. The late night talk show host, as discussed in this book, he dresses like an executive of a major corporation. He seems like a CEO hosting the annual investors meeting, like Steve Jobs doing a big annual presentation for Apple Computer or something. There's this strange sense of formality that defines the proceedings. And there is a sense that's catered to or pandered to, that the audience worships the host and that he's a kind of superhero. So there's a contrast to the confrontational, adversarial crowd work that now dominates stand-up comedy. And guys, it's such a bad combination. So on the one hand, you have this really self-indulgent, self-centered talk therapy. People are like, oh, this is my chance to tell you about my childhood trauma on stages, and I talk about what a bad childhood I had. And then this is combined with the so-called crowd work of the stand-up comedy actively insulting people in the audience, really fighting with people in the audience back and forth. It's terrible. So by contrast, I just think this is a telling example from here. Jay Leno gets a request from the audience, and this was staged. It was a real person from the audience, but they asked them to read this line. And she said, so she stands with the audience, she says, Jay, I'm here with my son. He had a red balloon. While we were standing in line to come to the show, he let go of his balloon, like a helium balloon, and flew off. Do you have another balloon backstage you could replace it with? And he says, no, I don't. But, hold on 1 second. I'll take care of that for you. So he then walks out the door, and it cuts to a pre-recorded segment. And seemingly, he walks out the door, climbs a mountain, and from the top of the mountain, catches the red balloon, the same red balloon, out of the sky, and then comes all the way back to the studio, brings it back, and then walks in with the red balloon, hands it to the little kid, and the people applaud, right? Look, again, I'm not saying it's not funny, like in the broadest sense of funny. It's funny, it's silly, it may be charming. But, like for me, is this even a joke? Is this a punchline? Is this humor? Is this comedy? And I would even say it's not. Like, this is not even comedy. And also, it's pointless. There is no point. And again, really great comedy, including Moliere, including the ancient Greek stage roads, whatever you guys want to go to. Sorry, I actually think Airplane 2 is better written than Airplane 1. Okay, I'm going to, this is my opinion. If you want to look at some of the most successful comedies in the history of American cinema, I think you can ask that too. Isn't comedy funnier when there's a point, when there's a direction? Indeed, when there's a character and there's character development, or there's tension, or what have you. These other elements, they're also important to comedy. They're important to drama and storytelling more broadly. But yeah, reason I mentioned this here in response to what Melissa said, I think that is significant. This idea that the late night host, in a sense, he does do crowd work, but it's nothing like the crowd work assumptions of stand-up comedy in 2023. Now, I would add also, so instead, there's a little bit, in some ways, he's like Steve Jobs. In some ways, he's like a CEO or the executive of an important company making a presentation that's strange formality. In some ways, he's like a superhero, someone they're supposed to look up to and cheer for in these different ways. I would also say there's relatively little role for self-deprecating humor. Now, can't say there's zero. Maybe once in a while, Jay Leno complains that he's fat and struggling to lose weight. But stand-up comedy in the 21st century is dominated by self-deprecating humor, which again combines very poorly with the other elements. So male stand-up comedians talking about how bad they are at sex, or how much their wife detests them, is dissatisfied with them, how stupid they were in school. Like really, there's a lot of self-deprecating humor, self-hatred, or what I want to say, a lot of low self-esteem on stage in stand-up comedy, and much of it contrived. Very often, these people are egomaniacs when you talk to them off stage, but they pretend to have low self-esteem for the sake of the comedy. So that too is probably a difference. So when we saw live stand-up comedy, maybe you're talking about an 8-minute set, maybe a 5-minute set, maybe a 3-minute set. And for me, it's like, look, when I think about just doing a comedy monologue on YouTube, it's 30 minutes. I'm talking about doing 30 minutes around, I would doing one 30-minute comedy video a week would be nothing for me. It's very little work. It's not that much material. Now, whether or not you want to do it, whether or not there are any rewards for doing it is another question. Whether or not you want to spend 6 months that way, By the way, writing and recording a satirical song and that's a lot more work. It's a lot harder for me than a 30-minute monologue, even a 1-hour monologue. And once you get into working with other people and having a scripted scene or a whole movie, okay, now we have more orders of complexity being brought in. Is orders of complexity a thing? I'm sorry, there's orders of magnitude in this quote. Orders of magnitude of complexity. Well, no. Can someone Google that? Someone from the audience? Orders of complexity. Did I just make that up? No. But yeah. So as bad as this book is, as bleak and hopeless and depressing as the model of comedy in it is, still there's a fundamental commitment to originality, to making up new material, not just every month, not just every week, but every day, that I admire. So for the right person, this book would be worth reading. Something else interesting, whether you're talking about politics or philosophy or history, there are a lot of authors who are sort of strong with abstract reasoning on a chalkboard, and then they suck when it comes to tangible, real-world examples and outcomes and implementation. This book is the opposite to a terrifying extent. As I said again and again, the main value of the book is just in the examples it provides you with. And some of you may find that encouraging and uplifting. As I've said, I find it horrifying and discouraging, and it makes me want to have absolutely nothing to do with comedy writing. It makes me want to have nothing to do with stand-up comedy or anything else for the rest of my life. That's really the effect of this book on me. So it's had a big impact, and maybe it will for you too. It's interesting, though, that within, say, the first third of the book, he's interested in framing these examples with his own theory of comedy, his own philosophy of comedy. And to say that is horseshit would be an insult to honest manure. But that's also kind of interesting in its way. Throughout the whole book, his theory or his philosophy, it does recur. It's kind of explained at length in the first third, but then it comes up in brief bullet point form later on. He refers back to it as something you're supposed to understand. There's a parable in Buddhist philosophy of the monk with the stone robe. This is a monk who was very poor and very tough. And rather than lighting a fire to warm himself, he would close up the windows of his hut. And he had a big, heavy stone that he would pick up and then just walk back and forth, walk in a circuit within his hut. And of course, he found that this both warmed him up. He felt warm in terms of his own body, and then his body heat warmed the house, so to speak. By the way, this is apparently an actual historical example and not mere fantasy for various reasons. It's believable enough. So this was a monk who was staying in shape this way, and other monks noticed. One, that he was more muscular than the other monks, and they also noticed they had this large, heavy stone inside his kuti, is the term used in Pali. So anyway, the stone robe monk. The thing is this, it's very easy to, attribute the heat to the stone, and it's not the stone that's doing the work, right? It's you and me. It's you with your own body. You're warming yourself up. You're warming up the whole house. And there's a lot of that kind of error in reasoning here for how comedy writing works and how coming up with jokes works. Even these exercises he describes, where he's making a list of things and sort of drawing out a certain kind of diagram and drawing lines between different associations. I would challenge him, what if you had just stared out the window while thinking of jokes instead of looking at this piece of paper? Like, I do see how, especially with practice and time, I mean, I know you could draw pictures, while brainstorming ideas. Do you drawing these lines that is really where the comedy comes from? Do you actually okay, what hide your hands behind your back and you couldn't, to write out the list? Do you actually think it's like, now I can't write comedy at all because I can't sit and write out this list? What if we blindfolded you or something? Or again, what if you didn't have a pen and paper, you're sitting and looking out a window, and then you come up with a joke and let's say you read it into a tape recorder instead of writing it down. There's a lot of this kind of erroneous thinking in terms of his theory about what it is that makes comedy writing work, what it is that makes it better. And then he tries to link this to a really bizarre kind of mix of pop psychology and anthropology for how laughter is ultimately rooted in the behavior of cavemen and the fear of you hear something rustling behind a bush and then you look into the bush, you're expecting a poisonous snake, but it's something else and you laugh. He tries to root this in kind of phony psychology and phony anthropology. Now, even that theory, again, there's still real value in the examples, but okay, so why is it funny for Jay Leno to climb a mountain and grab a red balloon out of the air? Like his theory can't explicate many of his own jokes in the books or jokes from these shows he works on that he's presenting you with. And yeah, look, there is a sense in which this book is trying to train you to be a successful comedy writer. And my sense of horror at the book is I feel this is actually training you to be a bad writer and to be a bad comedian. I'm not saying that he is. The actual author of this book is an incredibly successful, really, when you think about it, he must be one of the most influential comedy writers of his century. Most of his jokes, they aren't credited to him in a way you would recognize. But how many millions of people saw his jokes night after night? Jay Leno, David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, these other shows. So he's reached an enormous audience with his humor. I'm going to give you one more parable. If you knew someone who wanted to be a fashion designer, okay, the most reliable way to make money in the garment industry, in turning cloth into clothing, is to design clothing that is indistinguishable from what everyone else is already wearing. Trust me, if you can make a shirt that looks just like this one, you got a hit. Now, you make a shirt that looks just like this one. Can you make it 10% cheaper? Can you make it the same price but 10% higher quality? Can you have something like that? You got a hit. That's all it takes, guys. Zero innovation required. What you'll find is whether it's a young, ambitious person or a middle-aged person or an older person, at whatever age, when you meet someone who wants to go into fashion or the garment industry or clothing manufacturing or retail, wholesale, whatever it is, of course they want to change the world. Their point is not that they just want to imitate the already existing fashions. One way or another, they want to make clothes that matter. And I'm not saying this to ridicule the pretension, but it's actually very hard to visualize. What would it mean to make a pair of running shoes that matters? Everybody makes running shoes imitating Nike and imitating Adidas, those running shoes all the time. But that's not what we're going to do at our company. Those other companies, they make running shoes that are competing with the same. We're going to do something different. We're going to do something that really matters. Okay, what does it mean to make menswear that matters? To make a suit, to make a shirt? This is something that matters. This is something important. This is something meaningful in fashion. Now, I'm genuinely, I'm not ridiculing this. I've known a few people who were in the fashion world at different times in my life. I wasn't seeking them out, but just in life you bump into and talk to such people. And I wouldn't make fun of them for having that sense of meaning and purpose. But wow, it's really pretty abstruse and hard to get to. What's the difference between a meaningful and a meaningless pair of running shoes? A meaningful and a meaningless summer line of men's business. But if I say to you the difference between meaningful and meaningless comedy, everyone here knows. I don't have to explain a goddamn thing. And probably from your own life. whether as a child, you could probably reflect back on it at a time when you saw comedy, stand-up comedy, or a movie or a TV show, and it really meant something to you. For you personally, it really mattered. And probably there were also been times when there was comedy that got reported in the newspapers, like somehow crossed over into being a political news story, that there was a stand-up comedian who said something or did something, or there was a comedy movie that came out that really challenged something in an important way. That in that sense, not just for you personally, but on a broader scale, for the culture, or for the progress of civilization, or for politics in our time, there was comedy that matters. Want to jump in?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that is both a statement and also a question for you. So hopefully you will find it relevant. So you were talking about fashion,
Yes.
and for this reason, I'm maybe hoping that this will piggyback off of that concept. So you get people writing into you asking you to cover certain topics.
Yeah.
Many times I hear from you, oh, this is something in the news, and maybe even somebody wrote to you asking for you to comment on it, and you tell me, I'm not going to comment on that for this reason and that reason. Totally makes sense. And I remember when I was first seeing Abala Ciel, when I saw your YouTube videos,
on tonight's show, my top 10 list, top 10 ideas for videos that did not make the cut at Abala Ciel.
Exactly right. Yes. So you would say, I'm not going to respond to every controversy, the controversy of the moment. I want it to be meaningful 5 years from now when I look back on this. Right. So since this man who wrote this book, he has been successful in late night TV comedy writing. Right. I can gather that, maybe this book is preparing you to be a successful writer in that way. But, it's very rare. I think it's very infrequent that anybody can recall listening to the late night hosts and they think of it as something that really changed their life, something really meaningful, or even that they thought about it 5 years later. Oh, I remember that one night that Jay Leno made this joke and it changed my life forever or something. I guess what I'm asking is this type of transient humor, the kind of thing that's just commenting on what's popular at that time, versus Moliere. Today you can read that, and also the ancient Greek authors, you can read that. So
some of this stuff is easier to work through with particular examples than in broad outline in the abstract. Okay, so I think university is a ripoff. You think university is a ripoff. We both think universities and colleges are corrupt and instructors are incompetent. Okay, there have been a lot of comedies about the American university system. And, a lot of them really what it's about is glorifying the sexuality of teenagers, glorifying alcohol and, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. A lot of it is a kind of, frankly, masturbatory middle-aged nostalgia, reflecting a certain dream of what your college years are supposed to be. Okay, how about the challenge of writing comedy that matters? Like I'm still talking about making a funny movie. I'm not talking about making a documentary. I'm not talking about making something depressing. But what about a comedy that's really a critique of what's wrong with university education? That's really showing you how and why the system is corrupt, and showing the reality of just how much money people are paying, how much it costs, and everything else is wrong. How much money they're paying for how little education, how little they're learning, or what have you. Now, I'll be real with you. What I've just described, it would be easier to make a documentary about that. To make a documentary film about that would be quite easy. As a creative writing challenge, think about making a comedy. By the way, I'm not a prude. We can have nudity every second scene for all I care. I'm not against sexuality comedy. I'm just saying most of the university comedies, the college romp comedies, that's really what they are. They're not dealing with the reality of what's wrong with the education system and the consequences, And again, so you guys might be thinking, oh, he's talking about Moliere, he's talking about Shakespeare, he's talking about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that I'm setting the standards so high. Again, so there's real political significance to that. I think you could do a satirical James Bond film, a satire about espionage. Great example. The role of the CIA in the assassination of John Kennedy, President Kennedy. Be a great subject for a comedy, right? There's so much to draw out of it. I'll be real with you. Like in terms of the potential for comedy, that just dealing with the racism of 1963 would be a hilarious aspect of it. I mean, there's so much to work with there. This guy Jack Ruby, he's a career gangster. He owns a strip club. Sam Giancana is the head of the mob in Chicago. Sam Giancana fixed the elections for JFK. It's a comic goldmine, right? But that can be comedy that matters. And for a whole generation of people, that could be the real heads up about government corruption and a whole host of political issues. I'm not saying this insulting with eyes. There'd probably be people under 20 years old watching it who'd never heard of the Cuban Revolution before, never heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, oh, yeah, I saw this great comedy. And, gee, I didn't even know there was this thing where they were saying there was going to be a nuclear war with Cuba. Like, what? It would, like, without even trying to be educational. And again, guys, you could have nudity once every 5 minutes. I mean, I'm not a prude. And you could have slapstick humor, too. You can have comedy that involves violence and people getting hit over the head with a can of paint or whatever. It's not that I'm saying it all has to be super cerebral. And so again, this goes back to what I said earlier in the video. When I'm trying to dumb down what I'm interested in comedy, when I think I'm going to the floor, what I'm shocked by is seeing like, whoa, these supposedly intelligent people, they're drowning, they're struggling to keep up. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess this is part of the problem. In some ways, this is part of the solution. We have a whole culture that's conditioned for this kind of lowest common denominator for comedy. Okay, so guys, cinema is dying. Okay, radio is dying. I mean, the recorded music industry is dying. Conventional TV broadcasting is dying. The book publishing industry is already dead. Really. It's one that impacts me very, very deeply personally. It's sad to see it go, but whatever. The PDF has rendered the book obsolete. The instantly transmissible PDF via internet has rendered the book a thing of the past. And, if you do porn, softcore, hardcore, you can monetize your web presence pretty easily. If you're a good-looking young woman who does stand-up comedy, all you need to do is simultaneously have an OnlyFans account, and there will be guys who see you perform comedy on stage live, and they'll think, I'd like to see a little bit more of her than I saw on stage. It's very easy to monetize that. However, I just mentioned this. There have been a couple different news stories about female athletes doing this now. For the vast majority of women in sport, they either earn no money at all through sport or kind of symbolic amounts of money. Now, plenty of men are athletes. They're just not good enough to be at the most elite level where they're making money. But, okay, how much money do you make as a woman playing lacrosse? How much money do you make as a woman in track and field? Like, I mean, there's so many of these sports. How much you make as a woman in women's sumo wrestling. Again, plenty of male athletes who also earn very little money or none at all. But with women's sport, it's extreme. And then there's the contrast. So let's say you have a woman who plays volleyball. So she stays in shape to play volleyball, and people see her body. Which, okay, do you want to in parallel have an OnlyFans account so you can monetize this body that you're working so hard to maintain anyway for the sport of volleyball? My point is this: right now, there is really no way to monetize writing as such. And I'm just being honest with you. I think film is going to catch up with the written word this way. What's happened to the book publishing industry? It's already happening to cinema. What happened to the CD industry? When downloadable music replaced physical media, that's happening to all other media. And I already said earlier, if you're doing stand-up comedy, it's tremendously meaningful that YouTube lets you archive your past work, record it, and keep it forever. You don't feel that you're losing all your hard work. Even if you yourself 5 years later get to go back and watch maybe you're sitting thinking, I remember I made a joke about Iran back when those women's rights protests were happening. What was that? You can go through your own YouTube history and find it and hear it again. I think it's wonderful what YouTube allows you in that sense. But if you are trying to pay the rent in New York City If you are actually trying to earn enough money as a creative artist to pay the rent in any major city in the Western world, New York, Los Angeles, London, Toronto, Tokyo, or Montreal, we're at the point right now where we can say it's incredibly difficult or it's incredibly unlikely. And I see the directions moving in. Pretty soon, it's going to be simply impossible. We're transitioning to a period where there is absolutely no money in the game. Now, I said this many years ago, talking about vegan activism and political activism on YouTube. In some ways, that's a beautiful thing. Like, you could say this in the fashion industry too. So what if you're in the fashion industry, you're looking around and think, these people don't really care about clothes. These are just businessmen. They just care about money. They're not pure artists like me. How much better would the fashion industry be if it was just people who really care about the clothes? People are in it for the clothes, in it for the style, in it for the fashion. Well, that's one element of what's happening. The kind of the demonetization, the amateurization of all these things. In some ways, it's very positive because the motive to earn money is dwindling or disappearing. But in other ways, it's negative. I'm astounded at how difficult it is to get 5 comedians to work together. I know this because there's a podcast hosted by David Spade, but David Spade and Chris Farley, they didn't get along, and most of the time on the podcast, he tried, Chris Farley's dead. He tries to present this in a positive light, but every so often it comes out how they really hate each other. The 2 guys who made Wayne's World, so you want to help me out with my memory here? Mike Myers and Dana Carvey. Are you right? Mike Myers and Dana Carvey, during the filming of Wayne's World, in that period, they hated each other. They didn't get along. Chris Farley was trying to sleep with the same girl as David Spade. And when David Spade got the girl and Chris Farley didn't, to my knowledge, it wasn't a long and meaningful relationship, just based on the few words what I've heard. I'd assume this was a groupie or something, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was a more meaningful relationship than that. You could see that David Spade was very uncomfortable talking about it. A lot of these people really hated each other, and they were motivated and compelled to work together by millions of dollars. And a lot of what I see happening and not happening in stand-up comedy right now, it relates to the fact that, most of these people, in the absence of a really powerful motivation, such as millions of dollars, what they will do with the art form will instead be 100% self-centered, 100% self-indulgent, and they either won't cooperate with anyone at all ever, or they'll only cooperate with someone who's basically their identical twin or their slave, someone who's totally subordinate to them. And that's a huge problem. I think it'd be a huge problem for any kind of art form, but it's a huge problem for comedy especially. Comedy really needs to arise out of exactly the sort of lively conflict that happened between David Spade and Chris Farley. I mean, there's maybe an argument you make better comedy, when you're working with someone who you hate or who hates you, rather than someone you love and admire and look up to, or someone you slavishly obey and never question, or when you're working with your own identical twin, someone who just has so much in common with you that there's no significant contrast. I am half Jewish, in case you don't know. I met a stand-up comedian in New York City who's half Arab, half Palestinian, in fact. I thought, this is a comedy goldmine. This is great. We can work together. He didn't see it that way. And the set I saw him do live, I gave him sincere praise for. I haven't seen him do anything great on YouTube or Instagram after that, actually. But I just give you this as an example. And Melissa, remember, I spoke to a couple of the black stand-up comics, the African-American stand-up comics. And they were guys I had nothing in common with, but that's the point. You want to work across those divisions. So Yeah, on the one hand, we're certainly moving towards this being a pure and even somewhat like a charitable art form, a money losing art form. So we saw stand-up comedians who are paying to perform. They're not getting paid. They're paying money to have their time on stage. And other people, they're getting paid, but the amount they're getting paid is less than the parking they're paying for. They're paying to park their car, and that costs more than they're paid to come and do their set in stand-up comedy. So yes, that's the new world we're living in. Okay. There was a time when Melissa was thinking about getting an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration. There was a time when Melissa was talking about getting into the stock market. And I bought her quite a stack of books, not because they were the most interesting books, not because they were the most enjoyable books, because you could really say, look, if you find this boring, if you find this horrifying, if you think I don't want to do this in the next 6 months of my life, okay, get out now. And that ultimately is the highest praise I can give this book. It has that quality of letting you know what you want to get out of. And for me, at this moment in history, when I think he's describing a dying art form in many ways. Certainly economically, an art form the money is disappearing from, the viability is disappearing from, so we'll soon be a relic of the past. For me, the most chilling part, the most discouraging part, is facing up to the reality of what it means to write jokes for an audience of people that I despise. And jokes that don't mean anything, jokes that don't go anywhere, that aren't part of a plot or a story, as opposed to the pursuit of what I consider comedy that really matters.